basically, I'm going to ask these guys just to say a couple of words about themselves. They have the opportunity to show us a couple of slides. It's really going to be a discussion about cartography, visualization, synergy, overlaps, differences. So you're going to tell us really where you are in the Carto-Viz spectrum, James.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So yeah, we've got 3 minutes. So I'm, for those who don't know me, I'm James, and I work at UCL. And I thought it was interesting today when David Henderson did the intro. He talked about how central cartography was to the Ordnance Survey, and then went on to say about data visualization and storytelling as their emphasis, which I thought that was a very interesting contradiction, perhaps, based on what we're talking about today, or an interesting note that where he sees the priority, it seems, is in storytelling and visualization, which may be different. So I'd like you to raise your hands when you think that this goes from becoming a data visualization to a map. So I didn't get a prize. If anyone can guess where this is from, I don't know, you'll get an Ordnance Survey coffee mug prize. So I think we could all agree that this is a data visualization. It's in German. We don't need to see necessarily what it's showing, but it's essentially transects over an ocean and showing the different values of temperature and things like that associated with that. This actually forms part of a larger image, which has 2 hemispheres worth of data on either side, and then actually we've got mountain ranges strung up between them with lots of labels. So the curvature, the labels and so on and so forth may look a bit more like cartographic representation for us, but there's still certainly a core component here, which I think was data. Does anyone think this qualifies as a map yet? Any kind of cartographic thing? Why don't we introduce some mountain ranges, sketches of the mountain ranges that are depicted, but actually I'm also introducing a kind of stacked bar diagram as well. Any takers for whether this is a map? Still a data visualization office on its own. So if I fill the picture in, we've got that, which of course is dominated by a map. So anyone think that this is a map overall? So my question really is, at what point does one thing disqualify the other? Can they be a data, as a whole, is this a data visualization? Or is it a map and a data visualization? And I think we need to think about where cartography starts and data visualization begins, if in fact those things are separate. And I guess my argument really is it's very hard to pull these things apart. I think these are some French transport atlases from the end of the 19th century. I'm fortunate enough to own a few in my office. And you can actually see that we've got 3 different things here, all featuring in the atlas. I think we would all agree that the one on the left, they're all showing broadly the same data, which is passenger numbers, or different slices through passenger data. On the left, I think we would agree that's a map. On the right, actually, there's spatial context there at the top one, but it's just a series of pie charts, which may not be a map based on some people's definition. And then I think we agree that this is not a map here, these are just line graphs. And again, it's actually a composition of different things that produce the whole in the case of this atlas. So what I think we need to think about is really where we want to sit as cartographers, is if at all we sit anywhere in this. I think often actually I hear conferences like this and people talk about visualization and cartography to be equivalent but different. Perhaps the top left scenario. I would argue that if that's where we think we are, life is actually looking more like the top right in this graphic, which is visualization is a way bigger thing than cartography is now in terms of industry and academic interest. It may be that we want to interact with them, and so there's almost like a Venn diagram, and there's overlaps, and that's potentially what I've been saying today. But it might actually be we have to be content looking like this, or even looking like this, where we become encapsulated by the world of data visualization, and we're just the guys making the maps in the middle. So I think in this diagram, or one of these, I think depending on where we sit, we have to make a much stronger argument for what's distinctive about cartography and map making from the broader data visualization piece, and I think that's something we might want to discuss in the panel. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, James. Giles, I know you're also an academic, so I'm sure we'll get another lecture, but short as you can, please.
Okay.
If you wanted a lecture, Steve, I could have given one.
Okay, thank you, James. Oh, well, actually, I'm not an academic, so I used to be, but I'm a practicing cartographer, so I'm coming at this debate from perhaps both angles. I can see both the academic side, but also the practical side as well. Cartography is not the same as visualization. Clearly, there are lots of things in common between them, but there are some specific aspects of cartography that make it different from general visualization, and that's really what I'm going to argue. Visualization is essentially sort of any technique for creating images or diagrams, or these days animations, to communicate a message. But the essence of cartography is that the data that you're depicting are spatial, and that component in the diagram, the spatial component, is absolutely essential to it. That's my first point. My second point is that the range of skills that you need in cartography actually is much more specific than the range of skills you need in visualization, because you have to understand the concepts of things like generalization, data, choosing your data, data selection, etc. All those conventions of cartography, which actually make it different. And what I want to do is just show you 3 diagrams which I think quite nicely illustrate why visualization is not the same as cartography. What often happens is that visualization in general has taken a lot from cartography, and what it tries to do is to make things which are not spatial, spatial. So here, for example, what this is showing is a job, the roles of a particular job. And what they've done is that they've put these into a graphic which makes it look like it's spatial, but actually there's nothing intrinsically spatial about anything to do with the photographer or a graphic designer or an illustrator or a creative director. So that's my first illustration. The second illustration is this one here, which comes from The Guardian, Plot Lies 2012. If you're to analyse the plots in the contenders for a Booker Prize, you can do it in this way. And what we've got on the left is the 12 shortlisted people for the Booker Prize, and on the right they're being mapped, and I use that term loosely, onto different subjects. So you can see a murder, nudism, there you go, sex, etc. And essentially it's trying to make something spatial that isn't spatial. So it's taking something from cartography, but it's different to cartography. And my third image is this one here, which, although it is a graphic, it's a form of visualization, I would argue actually is cartography. Global emissions, and what you've actually got here is countries which are being shown in the right proportion to the quantity of global emissions that they create. But the thing about it is that those countries are shown in roughly the right places geographically, and that's an important element. So the geography element comes into it. The spatial element is absolutely essential in this, and you need to understand something about cartography to produce this sort of thing.
Okay, thank you, Giles. Robin, would you like to just give us a feel for who you are, where you come from, where you stand in the spectrum of stuff?
Yeah, no worries. So my name's Robin Hawkes. I mean, I've never been formally trained in like cartography, for example. I mean, I fell into it probably about 7 years ago when I created a project called Busy Cities, which was, you know, an experiment with web technologies to try and create a 3D platform for visualizing cities and things like that. And kind of learnt my way from there, and now do sort of spatial consultancy on web, predominantly for web visualizations. So yeah, my background is much more from the visualization point of view rather than the, I guess, cartographic point of view, predominantly because of that lack of formal training, I would say. So, you know, I can make maps, I can, you know, use spatial data and use them to produce things that, you know, you could say are cartographic, but I wouldn't describe myself in that way. I would definitely describe myself as either, you know, not even data visualization, I would say spatial visualization is what I do. Yeah, so that's, I guess, kind of a little overview of kind of my perspective. I also have a newsletter called Spatial Awareness, which I do as well, which kind of highlights kind of my viewpoint on all of this sort of stuff, and I predominantly would.
So how did you feel about coming along and talking from the panel on cartography when you've self-admitted not being a cartographer?
Pardon?
How did you feel about...
Use the microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
You, yeah.
Sorry.
It's on, this may not be loud enough. Yeah.
Okay.
You just have to raise it a bit. No, I just wonder how you felt about coming before a group of cartographers.
It's an interesting one. We were talking about this earlier. I think it's a case of... because I wouldn't describe myself that way. I think it's an interesting one where, you know, when you think about it a bit more, yeah, of course, I do stuff that you would describe as cartography, but as I said, I don't describe myself as a cartographer. So I think for me it was quite an interesting one, and I think I would bring an interesting viewpoint, I would say, because of the difference in background.
Thank you very much. Craig, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Yes. So my name's Craig. I work for a company called Ito World. I wouldn't consider myself a cartographer either, and I wouldn't really consider myself as a data visualization practitioner. And I struggled with this topic because I sort of see myself traversing a lot of different spaces. I work generally with animating spatial data to create stories for lots of different clients. And obviously cartography underpins a lot of that because it's spatial. So it's really important. I've had cartography roles in the past. But I think the distinction between the two is less. It's actually a really tricky thing to define. It's got a very blurry boundary. You sort of think about data visualization as the interpretation of data. Well, that's exactly what cartography is, but in cartography we're obviously considering spatial relationships between data sets. So although both of them, you know, revolve around this idea of interpreting information, one of them is spatial and one of them isn't, the principles are still the same. We're understanding something, we're comprehending it, and we're trying to understand information presented in a certain way. So my argument was going to be that cartography was different to visualization. I started, like these guys, with some slides, and I wanted to take 3 different data visualization pieces from one of the Information is Beautiful Awards that had a spatial element, and I couldn't tell the difference between them. I ended up contradicting myself all the time, because even though many of these, what you would consider data visualizations, contained many of them had cartographic elements to them, they weren't necessarily in the form of a map. You know, one of them was looking at tree rings, and they were comparing that to migration patterns. And first glance, you'd say, oh, this isn't cartography, but actually it uses dot density. That's a thing we use in cartography. It actually had spatial representation, but just not accurate spatial representation in the terms of this area is different from this area in terms of distance or whatever. So I think it's a really difficult argument to argue. I'd say data visualization and cartography, it'd be interesting to actually talk about. As a cartographer, and you have a certain set of training skills, like you said, we understand scale, we understand generalization, we understand all these different components that allow us to build a map. Now, if you were to take a data practitioner who, and I'm overgeneralizing now, uses R, creates bar charts, gave them a piece of paper and said, can you draw a map? Would they do it as successfully as a cartographer would? Probably not, because a cartographer has a certain level of training, or we are taught certain things that are different fundamentally to what maybe a general data practitioner would be taught. So I think there's a difference there.
Okay, that's an interesting take. If I'm not incorrect, Giles has given a more strict drawing line between the two possible subjects. Does anyone from the floor want to comment either against or for that delineation that has been outlined? Does anyone want to make any comment about that? Okay. Yes, please. You have to shout.
My background is information design, so how to convey data from one source and then be able to convey it to an audience. And that's why I think cartography and data visualization do the same thing, because I see it from an information design practice, if you see what I mean. So I think actually we're splitting hairs slightly.
Anyone want to respond at all from there?
I think there's an argument that cartography sits within the wider data visualization. I think that's my personal opinion. Yeah. Obviously that might polarize some opinions, but I think that a data practitioner these days has to learn about web mapping, like data-driven journalism, for instance. The amount of maps that appear in media now is way more than it used to. So that's cartography creeping into what would have been a disparate entity. So I think you're right. I
agree.
I think they are similar.
I was thinking about this because it's interesting you said information design as well, because I was wondering if information design is the same as data visualization. Information and data are two different, information is a bit further down the line. There was a brilliant piece of information design in the Beefeater today on different types of cuts of meat and knives and things like that. That's information design. It's not necessarily driven by data, but I think that what's interesting, kind of where I think about this is really in really practical terms, what is the distinctive contribution of cartography, right? So in my case, I need to make a distinctive case for cartography when I'm proposing a new module to teach students. Is cartography a skill students need to learn? In most of your cases, I suspect you need to go and make money doing this and make a case for why cartography and maps are worth something to someone. And I think my perspective seems to be at the moment, there's maps as a service, which actually, it's not the map itself that people are interested in, it's the data beneath the map, which isn't necessarily cartography anymore. It's about data collection. Some of the talks we've seen today, the map is the tiny bit on the surface, then there's this kind of essentially a big database underneath, which is not it may be capable of creating cartographic representations, but the data itself is not necessarily a map, or I wouldn't view it as such. And then you've got this interface, which I think is a massive growth area for cartography, which is this idea that cartography can be a form of visualizing complex data. And the reason that it's successful at that is because many of us are used to working with complex data, and I would disagree with you about the fact that just because there's some kind of geographic representation of the world, it means it can only be a map. I think in data space, you can do cartographic representation just as effectively. And actually, I would argue as well that many of the skills, and you're talking about generalization and abstraction and all that, you can do that within a database as well when you're thinking about clustering data together. In the same way that you create color breaks for a map, that's basically clustering values together. You can do that in a data set, and you can churn out a different form of representation. That's still cartographic thinking. And so actually, I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's a very interesting question about whether essentially as a kind of official skill, whether cartography is distinctive from data visualization. And I think that that's a really important, I'd like to know the answer, because I'm teaching a course next year that's cartography and data visualization. That's what the module is called. So I'm firmly on the fence on this. But,
Come on.
Yeah,
Giles,
sorry,
yeah.
That's okay. I think it's quite important at this stage as well to distinguish between data and information. We live in an age of ever-increasing data. There's an infinite amount of data out there, but that is quite different from information. Information is an interpretation of data. It's usually the selection of the key points, the salient points in a data set, and then that then becomes something that's meaningful. And I think that I agree with quite a lot of these arguments that it is maybe an arbitrary distinction. But the fact that yesterday, for instance, we had, 60, 70 people at a better mapping seminar suggests that there are many people who do data visualization, but they don't know very much about cartography, or they would like to know more about cartography, which suggests to me that it is a distinct set of skills. And I think we all know, if you can't actually define it in concrete terms, you all know the difference between a good map and a bad map in terms of its ability to communicate information. And clearly visualization is also about communicating information, but cartography is a very particular way of doing it, and that spatial element is absolutely essential in the interpretation of data.
Would anyone like to argue, can I just make one point, would anyone like to argue that the use of a visualization rather than a traditional map actually allows you more freedom to make more information come from that data? just posit that as a thought.
Just one more thought. Just the
One more.
word mapping is an interesting one because I also get involved with kind of software engineering companies and they're really into mapping, but what they mean is mapping processes and agile thinking and all of these kind of key words in terms of project management. So when we're talking about mapping, we have to be very clear about when we're talking about creating maps rather than mapping a workflow or so this I think the terminology has kind of been flung about quite a lot in terms of all of these words and they kind of got turned into a bit of a mélange, you know. So we have to be quite clear about what we're trying to achieve with each of these descriptions.
Can we take your point now, please?
On the survey, once 50,000, everybody knows it. What would you be like without symbols on it? Surely the symbols on the 50,000 visualisation. Would you be able to interpret 50,000 if you didn't have symbols?
Well, it's interesting. If I heard David Henderson correctly this morning, he mentioned both cartography and visualization. And I think the point that was underlying what he was saying was that they can both contribute to exposing data in a meaningful way. And you're right, the elements of a map.
You wouldn't read it if you didn't have the map.
Absolutely. Or take the background away, would you be able to understand what the symbols were actually doing? Yes.
Do you think it's dangerous to align yourself into, you know, do you think it's a dangerous way of thinking to try and separate cartography from data visualization? You know, should we be sitting in one camp or should we sort of align ourselves with many? Like I said, the modern GIS and cartographer, however way we look at it now, it's not just mapping anymore, is it? It's web design, it's all sorts of stuff. It's not just your traditional put some layers on a map, add some context. There's a lot more to mapping these days, and I think we're increasingly, you know, becoming broader in terms of our duties and our responsibilities and our training and skills that we learn as well. And I think, you know, should we be outcasting ourselves by saying, "Oh, cartography sits over here. Oh, we're not to do nothing to do with you."
I think, like, to me, that's probably more in line with what I'm thinking. Is that, you know, it's quite hard to make that distinction. And I think, you know, before this panel, just trying to work out, you know, where I stand on it, it was quite interesting for me to try and work that out. And I think really the end result was that I don't really see the distinction as such. I think there's a grey area in the middle between, you know, what is perhaps, you know, purely cartographic and what is purely visualization. But I think everything in the middle is up for grabs. And I think there's a sort of grey area there. And I think, you know, it really depends on the circumstance of, you know, what you're building, who it's for, what you're trying to communicate, how you're trying to communicate it. And I think, you know, there's no right or wrong, because really that depends exactly on that situation. And also it depends on who's interpreting that as well. So depending on, you know, who is actually looking at that visualization or that map, you know, they're going to have a different interpretation of what is that cartography or is that visualization. And I think, you know, that's why it's always going to be quite difficult to differentiate the two, if it's even possible, is that everybody has a different understanding of that.
This is going to be a contrary question. We're trying to get rid of or blur the lines between the two. But maybe I could ask any of you if you've got a comment on what the one discipline, if you like, can learn from the other, and what you as individuals, wherever you sit, can learn from looking at other good and bad examples.
I can certainly answer that from my perspective, because as I said, like, I'm not formally trained in cartography and areas like that. I've always had an interest in maps. You know, I fully understand spatial data and how to, you know, communicate using that. But I think from my perspective, by leaning more on the visualization aspect, there's certainly a vast amount that I can learn from, you know, the more formal aspect and the more cartographic and the science area of it. And, you know, just trying to phrase it in a better way, but like the techniques and things like that, there's certainly a lot that can be learned from a visualization point of view to make those better. You know, whether that's to better understand the circumstances of what, you know, that data or what that data is communicating, how all the kind of background behind you know, datums and projections and all that kind of stuff is incredibly important. And there's only so much you can learn by self-teaching and things like that. And I certainly hit that limit quite often myself. And then you go off and find someone who knows more about this to teach me, or teach myself again by going online. But I definitely think there's a lot that can be learned, certainly from the visualization perspective, from the cartography perspective, and I would argue probably the other way too.
James, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is whilst it is a slightly contrary question at times, and it does seem artificial, this actually is really fundamental, this question, because I'm very strongly of the view that it is what will save or otherwise the kind of cartographic community. So can I just ask, who here has done formal cartographic training in the last 10 years? Because lots of people have put their hands up. Okay, in the last 20 years? 30 years? 40 years? Okay, so the largest group with the last 40 years, okay, people have done it. About 2 or 3 hands went up in the last 10 years. And part of the problem with that is that there isn't anywhere to do it now. At the undergraduate level, there isn't I think Nick might correct me on this, but I think the last time UCL Geography did a course with cartography in it was like the 1960s or something. So, Peter Wood, who's an emeritus professor, I think he taught it, he's still here, and he said, I taught that in 1967 or something. It's not on the curriculum. The vehicle to get cartography back on the curriculum is data visualization. It's not cartography. And that's the reality. And I think it's the same kind of thing that's happening with statistics and data science. It's the same argument, basically. The statisticians going, well, we do stuff properly, and we've got all these like carefully collected data sets, and it's great. And then you've got these computer scientists coming in who are just blowing the place to bits with all their machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence, and most of which is grounded in statistics one way or another. But their processing is different. They're working with messy data, unproven data, and they're picking through it. And I do kind of, you said there was 50 people here yesterday. If this was a data visualization conference, there'd be 500 or even 5,000 people here actually. And there might be a stream on map making which would attract 200 or 300 people at a time. And so I think that, lots of people stood up and said, I'm not formally trained cartographer. Well, that's, quite a few of us aren't, and there's nothing to apologise for about that actually. I think it's just people have seen maps, they enjoy them, and they engage with them, and then they take those and do something useful with them. I think we're now at a point where we do have to seriously think about, is there a future for cartographic education as a standalone entity? Because I would argue that I think it has to be part of data visualization.
Could I go out first?
Yeah.
Could I take the gentleman in the middle there, please?
Just your final point, so Portsmouth University, Newcastle, I think a Masters up at Glasgow, there are core survey mapping science, BScs, MScs, UCL, whatever, that are grasping the geography, engineering, sciencey kind of STEM students and getting into the industry. I did that Newcastle course, it was great. That was my entry into all this, and that's, so I'm sure you all know Dr. Dave Bear then, that's 3 years of Dave's specific, spatial, geomatics, cartographic, mapping. Wow.
But just a quick response. Dave's retiring. I don't know that they'll replace him with someone else who does cartography, so that's gone. Our MSc program gets 9 people on it. Which is cartographic, that had traditional GIS. We're revamping it for data science, and our target will be 50 or 100. The reality is that there isn't, there may be a few people coming in, but 3-degree programs across the country, that is not enough to sustain an industry. If you contrast that with what's happening in the US and the way that's completely the map making there, and the linkage with data science and everything is much tighter. There's many more programs feeding into it, and I think that this is a serious question for us in this room about what's going to happen in 10 years' time or whatever, because I'm not teaching anyone at the moment who could come to this, with the exception of Helena, who's won the prize. But
Giles, do you want to take it on?
Yeah, just picking up, I think your points are really interesting. The most interesting point to me was that the statisticians are objecting to the fact it's the computer scientists who are now taking over, and I fully understand that. And I think perhaps in the world of cartography and visualization, one thing that occurs to me is that somebody this morning mentioned the question of ethics, and the fact that a cartographer has a certain ethical obligation to be as honest as possible. That's often unwritten, but you sort of know it, and it's actually part of the training of cartography. And suddenly we find that the data visualizers are actually doing all these absolutely wonderful things. You wonder whether they have the same ethical standards or not, and I think that's a very similar argument to the statisticians giving way to the computer scientists. And it's something that the whole cartographic and data visualization community actually need to look at. In this age, as we know, how easy it is to communicate false information, and some people are more obsessed about it than others. But it is actually a germane issue for everybody when it comes to looking how we can actually best communicate information through graphics.
Could I just make a sort of a pragmatic point? Maybe we should actually take off our blinkers a bit and not cry about not being able to join the BCS with the SoC anymore. But there's a big organisation, which is actually American dominated and based, called the Data Visualization Society. Maybe the BCS should be making approaches to that organisation, saying maybe we could get together, or just to open our own eyes a little bit. Does that have any resonance with anybody on the panel or from the floor? Nope. Okay, David.
Things like that have happened over the years. I mean, this conversation is very similar to a panel we had at BCS, I think it must be at least 30 years ago. And then it was followed up soon thereafter a workshop at Leicester run by David Unwin, so it must have been in 1990. And there was this was when Alan McKechnie was getting into visualization and was very much engaged with the US, scientific visualization people and so on, and it was starting this, and I seem to remember the panel with people like Mike Wood and so on. So in some ways I'm a bit concerned we haven't really moved on from them. We're still having this debate, one part or the other, or how much do we overlap and so on.
But with respect, David, that kind of reflects on us as not having really done anything to change anything, if I may say that.
But I think the important thing is cartography has survived. And there was a lot of doom and gloom in the late 80s to the mid 90s, and people like David Ryan saying cartography doesn't exist anymore, when he was DG in this place. And I think that's no longer the feeling you get when you go to GIS conferences. People, since about, 10, 15 years ago, are paying much more attention to the visual presentation of information. And whether it's visualization or whether it's cartography, I don't think it really matters. But there is an increasing recognition that getting that message across visually effectively is important. And therefore, there's always going to be a role for us to be involved in that, almost regardless of what we call it. I end my lectures on cartography. There is still a program in the UK with cartography in the time talking about. MSc in Geoinformation Technology and Cartography is still going strong. You have something like 25 students this year. So that's the only program with cartography actually in the program title, never mind individual courses. But yeah, Georg Gartner signing off as being president of the ICA was saying, it's okay to be a cartographer. I think those of us that feel that way have got to be saying that. Not calming ourselves off this as something perhaps subservient to other people. We're photographers. We need to be proud of it. There's nothing wrong with it.
Thank you, David. Can we have one from the front row here, please?
I speak as a layman and an artist. I come at it from, I use data in one part of my work that I do. And the emergence of GIS systems as being fantastic to be able, because I work in the social sector as part of what I do, and that has been really useful to know where areas, maybe crime or social deprivation are. Now, my training is as an engineer, and I've used data for years, so that the emergence of data visualization is with technology has been really helpful. Cartography is something I've come into lately in the context of art, but I still need to represent it in a form. For example, if this is an A road, I need that road to appear wider than a footpath. So I am representing in a sense, data. The person can read, it's information to know that that's the main road I need to take if I'm going to Gateshead, because if I go on that little road there, it'll take me a lot longer.
Yeah.
So they're both information, but one is represented in a geospatial sense. Modern technology has also allowed me to do things like that, and to see information being presented geospatially. So I see an emergence, but I still see an importance of cartography, because in many respects, and I grew up in a world where using an ordnance survey map, there was a standard set of symbols that you knew meant this, this or this. You could pick any OS map up and you could read it. I mean, it was lovely seeing the art being represented in Southampton with that project, but we all recognised the colours were all wrong. We would get very confused if that was a map that was given to us. And it wouldn't be data presentation, it would be a map in that it would be laid out correctly. So as I understand it, cartography is about how we represent that information that can be read by anybody, whereas data is often a single subject to a narrow audience.
Anyone respond to that?
Yeah, I think what you're saying about artistry, visuals, and that being really important, yeah, that speaks volumes for me, especially. Like my work is very visual, but I think, and what you were saying, James, about cartography not actually being taught. I did my MSc over 10 years ago in GIS. I was never taught cartography, really. I was taught spatial science, I was taught spatial analysis. I was never really taught how to successfully draw a landscape plan. In the first engineering company I worked in, the first map I made, it got torn to shreds. And I got retaught how to make a map by a landscape artist who had been in the business for so long. And I think, yeah, it's a really difficult thing, and I've worked in so many different companies where I see GIS analysts come in and the quality of the output just isn't as good as what it should be for someone who's, you know, the analysis that we do in GIS is fundamental for our understanding of the data we're putting into it. And the work that we do and the modelling that we do is vital, and to not represent that in the best way possible, I think is underplaying what GIS and cartography is as a whole. And I think more emphasis should be on the visual output of the work, and whether that's cartography, whether that's information design, whatever it is, I think design in GIS is vital.
There's rules in cartography, whereas you don't necessarily in data visualization.
Well, I think you still have rules in data visualization.
But they can be flexible, because it is a subjective. It's subjective insofar as how best you can represent the data. There's no sort of, you don't have to have it described in this particular way to be understood. It's a large circle, so it means more information.
Yeah, but I think it's you know, if we look at GIS and mapping as lots of context, and we have to deal through hundreds of layers to provide information on what we're trying to show, that's exactly what this is doing here, but just in a different form. We're showing context, we're showing the information. I don't really know what this is showing actually, but I haven't looked at it that much. But what I'm saying is data visualization and infographics and whatever you want to call it, the same principles apply. It's just I think there's nuances in cartography and GIS that help us build maps better.
Can I take one from the middle row, the gentleman there, please? Yeah.
Yes, I fully agree with David, actually. I think it's the task of us cartographers to act, and not only to react, but also to act, because there are so many possibilities, technologies available, which you can make use of and do very good new applications. In my classes, I think the term cartography still exists in the title, but what we're actually doing is web and application programming, taking cartographic rules into account.
I don't know if it's the same topic, but one from the back row, please.
Yeah, something similar that I think other people have touched on, maybe not said explicitly, is that what we're essentially saying is that we have data visualizers who are experts, they are specialists at doing data visualization, and we have cartographers who are experts at making beautiful maps and informative maps. And that actually there is a spectrum between them of a whole bunch of generalists who may swing more to one pole than the other, that actually also do valuable work, but would really like to learn from the experts. And if you're trying to put things into boxes, as in, oh, the future of cartography is dependent on us putting us into a box that says cartography and defining very specifically what that thing is, I think that's the point at which you risk it dying. Because
Can I respond?
if you're not feeding the generalists the expert knowledge, you don't get future experts, but also you don't share that knowledge between disciplines, and then fewer people benefit overall. So I just wondered what the thoughts of that would be.
You want to respond to that, James?
I agree. I mean, I think we in this room can be guilty of actually having a very narrow definition of what cartography is actually, and what I think that's partly my point here, that there is a case to be made for broadening out the definition of cartography, and I think there's a strong and I would very strongly make that case. And actually, you know, you're right, there's loads of people making maps, there's more maps than ever, but you know, most of them will stand up here and say, sorry guys, I'm not a trained cartographer. You know, and that is partly the kind of the challenge here, is really, are we happy with that? You know, is the positive outcome here, we see more maps than ever, and we can stand on the sidelines and complain about some of the poor decisions being taken and so on, or actually do we want to get in amongst it and start to properly engage with it? And I think that there's a huge amount that cartography can bring to data visualization if it just kind of steps over that boundary and says we are in the business of data visualization as well. And likewise, I think a lot of the data visualization thinking and technical skills associated, you know, that come from computer science, programming, all that kind of stuff, are things that we as a community need to learn a lot more from as well, in order that we can then successfully engage in some of these conversations and actually demonstrate what a good map is from a particular data set, rather than just saying, well, you know, whatever, they coloured the sea green and the land blue, you know, I wouldn't have done that if I'd followed the rules, you know, something like that.
Kind of, yeah, very quickly, Robin, yes please. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, like, just based on, you know, one of the things that you mentioned, I've heard it quite a lot, is like, you know, there's a reduction in places to actually learn cartography as such as a skill set. And like, you know, where is that now? Like, if it's not, you know, there's not enough courses and stuff, like, where can people go as visualizers, I would say, to learn more about, you know, the techniques that they should be using? I think that's a question that I'm not sure if I'd answered yet, and maybe that's because I'm thinking more from the outside in, perhaps. But you know, where would I go if I wanted to learn more about cartography?
I can think of quite a good book.
Yeah, well, comment maybe. I think it's a non-debate, just because you're going to call yourself what you are and what you do based on your upbringing, background, training, experience and that. And yes, for some of us in the room, we're cartographers. Curiously, I've never been a cartographer. And for others, you know, they might have come through graphic design, media courses, computer science courses, but I was making maps and graphs and infographics 30 years ago, and people are making maps and graphs and infographics now, just with different tools, different software, different approaches, but it's all ostensibly the same thing. And I would make the point that BCS just awarded the top prize today to what I would call a piece of map art, which is possibly more of a data visualization than a map.
And I'm a computer scientist.
There you go. Yeah. So you know, it's whatever you want it to be.
Isn't a map a form of data visualization? It's geospatial.
It can be, but I've got an answer for James. Spatial data visualization is your course title.
Is it?
I don't know, it should be.
No. I was going to say, it's so long since I filled the form in and haven't written materials yet. I'd forgotten. I thought you looked it up on the website.
Identity crisis. Claire, did you have a point?
I wanted to ask, so I've spent 20 years of my career bridging the gap between graphic designers and GIS users. And that's been great, because I've been able to get those graphic designers to learn more about what geography is and what data is available to them, especially more recently. And more recently, I've had the pleasure of teaching GIS users some cartography and you can't always do that. Their minds are different. A GIS user's mind works differently to a graphic designer's mind. Where do data visualization students fit? For me as an employer, if I'm looking for another cartographer and there's not another Oxford Brook student coming through or a cartographer trained coming from there, where do data visualization students excel in? But are they more on the analytical GIS, like data science? Because there's data sciences words used and then infographics, and it's a bit confusing for me because I'm like, are they expert in that field with the left side of the brain or the right side of the brain kind of thing? Because that's, I've over 20 years found that to be quite a key thing for somebody's career and what they're really interested in and what grabs them and what they want to go in the future.
So what Claire is asking you to give is questions for her next interview for a colleague.
Well,
response?
I think, so first thing to say is we're talking about data visualization as a big homogenous blob, but actually within the community it's not. I mean, there's like loads of there's InfoVis and there's academic data visualization versus design, and there's all these kinds of debates and things going on there. So, you know, I tend to, well, the stuff I do is with geography students and across other departments, and actually my ambition is to churn out graduates who can take a tangible problem and solve it in a understandable way and using data to support their arguments. And so the talk about data storytelling and all that kind of stuff, you know, that's actually the importance there. If you go to big tech companies and talk about the kinds of people they want as graduates, it's the people who can, they don't, you know, they've got plenty of computer scientists, they've got plenty of data kind of statisticians and all those kinds of people. What they need is someone who understands the real world, can place themselves and the data in the context of that and answer important questions and then be able to explain it to people who are not technical. That's basically. And you know, so much of map making is that process. And so actually, the connections I try and build between map making, cartography and the data, teaching students data skills are those sorts of connections where you can say, well, actually, you know, if you view the amount of work that goes into a map as a bit of a pyramid, you know, the map's at the top, but the base of that pyramid actually is a lot of sifting through data and finding a story and being happy with the story that you can then visualize in such a way that it can be understood more broadly.
Caroline?
So I just wanted to say that everyone in the room has got their expertise, and we need to be sharing that with our professionals in other fields. So I teach as well. I teach students and I teach professionals, and the students have got a very clear idea about what they want to achieve in terms of a 3-year, you know, or a very long-term project type thing, and that's what they're trying to achieve with their PhD, for instance. And then the professionals want to pick it up quickly, run with it, and actually do some work with it. So they want to react really fast. So we could be communicating cartography to all the other professional bodies and saying, this is the way to do it, this is the better way to do it, rather than just being a crash course on the software, but this is all the principles that underline it. And I think that's how we grow our base, is by talking to our fellow professionals and going, this is a better way of doing cartography.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think for new people coming into the field as well, I think it's really important to, you know, to share their work and for other people to critique it. I think what you were saying about you were saying about where to go for training. Yeah. Well, you know, you just need to look at a Twitter feed and type in GIS and see some really, you know, helpful people on there that give workflows to how you can achieve certain styles, certain ways of designing information. I think social media and the rise of it is really helping that as well. And I think, you know, there is an importance for us as cartographers, whatever we want to call ourselves, to welcome them new people into the field as well, and to be constructive in our criticism and help them to sort of make better maps. And I think that discourse, whether it's informal or formal or however you want to phrase it, you know, there's lots of Slack channels, there's lots of places you can go, there's spatial communities, and your newsletter is really good. But there's plenty of places out there that you can get some form of training, whether it not be, you know, formal training, however cartography was trained in the past. I think it's just different now. There's more informal ways of doing it, and that's how I learn a lot of stuff I learned.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think some of the reasons why, you know, for example, like when I introduced myself and said I'm not formally trained in cartography, I think some of that's a protection mechanism to, you know, avoid scrutiny. I think to kind of get away with perhaps it not being perfect and things like that. And you know, that's, you know, why I raised the point about like where to learn. Like, you know, it's as much for me as it is for other people. And I think it's a case of, I think, breaking down some of those barriers of the scrutiny, or at least making it more friendly for people to be able to put things out for you know, I didn't know exactly what I was doing. Give me some, you know, constructive feedback and stuff like that. And I think, you know, like you said, like Twitter and places I've found incredibly useful for stuff like that. I think it depends what communities you're involved in. Maybe not go on Reddit, but you know, Twitter, not so bad. But it's like, you know, my background is in developer relations and, you know, teaching people and getting people excited and bringing them into communities that they perhaps weren't in originally. And I think, you know, I don't know, is there an equivalent for cartography? I'm not sure, but, you know, I think maybe some more work can be done around bringing people in and, you know, like everyone was saying, just sort of teaching them how to do things, what are the techniques and things like that.
It was not about bringing people in and teaching them, but did anyone see how many entries there were for the, what was it called, what was originally called the monochrome?
Mono maps, yeah, I know I judged it. It took ages, about 300.
Yeah, and what seemed to be just a spur of the moment thing turned into a huge, great challenge to put yourself out there and have your stuff looked at. Can I just make a point on the sharing point you made? Can I just have a straw poll? Anyone in this room ever taken their thoughts about cartography to IBG, given a paper about cartography at IBG? Me and Alex. Anyone been to AGI? You know, do we go out of our own little room enough? How many people in the room have ever presented at GeoMob? How many in the room have ever presented at Longitude? You know, there are forums which are really good for the informal presenting of your work, and even some critiquing, perhaps in the networking space that's on at the same time. Alex would like to reply to that.
Yeah, just an observation. Sorry I came in late, but just for the actual reason I was having a debate with my own dean about the meaning of cartography. And what's very interesting, I think what's a real challenge, and sorry, you might have covered this earlier, is really cartography's position and its relationship with geography, and that has been, I think, quite detrimental recently, perhaps over the last 30 years or whatever, for the actual development of cartography. And what we see these days, in my mind, is a much more sort of opening up from lots of different disciplines, and there is an idea of sort of claiming cartography from lots of different angles, from English departments, from history departments, and so on. And that kind of traditional sort of wedding, if you like, with geography is starting to maybe erode. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. And what reminded me, Steve, to say all this is actually the number of the instances or examples of conferences he mentioned were pretty much all to do with geography, IBG, AGI, the G is there, G. And it makes you think perhaps that, yes, we ought to be confident, like Gail Gartner saying, yeah, it's okay to be a cartographer. Well, actually, I say it's best to be a cartographer, for goodness sake. You know, where else do you get to be so creative with data and order the world as you want it? I know I'm sounding like Sauron from Lord of the Rings, but you know, there's something very, very special about that whole relationship that you have as a connection with place and the data that you're shaping so that other people can understand it in a particular way. So I think there is great scope to be confident about cartography in the future, and maybe that involves slightly distancing ourselves from perhaps geography. Maybe that's more about my own future, my university. But
I see that as complementing things like engineering and software engineering. Do you know what I mean? And so that's my kind of
You want to make a point there, yeah?
I just wanted to agree with Ken. So because not anymore, but because I was a recent graduate specializing in cartography, I was able to get citizenship to Australia. So it's not well known. People don't know about it. They think you're a car photographer. But it is still a desired trait. You can move countries, you can, I'm in England now, I've been in Canada, I've been in India, now I can retire in Australia, be a little lady at the beach. Also, I get work because initially people go to graphic designers. They think, okay, graphic designers make maps. Then they realize they don't have any spatial concept, nothing's correct. Then they go to the GIS person. They realize the GIS person doesn't have any specialization in design, so then they come to me. And so I think actually cartography is very important. It's just the name has gotten lost.
David, yeah, thank you.
Just to pick up on Alex's point about where cartography is. I mean, it was interesting to me that cartography, if you go into Germany, cartography is a branch of engineering.
Yeah, that's right.
If you go to Russia, cartography is a branch of surveying and geodesy, and it's a fairly junior member of surveying and geodesy. So it's not a given. We've done it in Britain that it's part of geography, but it ain't given. And there are very strong connections to other parts. And I think cartography and visualization, it's wonderful that we've got Lawrence here from Switzerland. I mean, cartography and visualization. Look at Swiss 25. There's cartography and visualization. The pair of them come together. It's absolutely stunningly accurate mapping. But as a visual product, I would argue that it's hard to beat.
Thank you. James.
I just respond to Alex. I mean,
I'm an engineer. I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
Not a geographer.
One at a time, please. James.
Just, I think you paint a much rosier picture of the relationship with geography than I have ever experienced. I mean, within my department, within my department, people have said to my face that we don't need people like you in this department because you do cartography and map making, and it comes with all these issues. What's changed in the last 3 or 4 years, actually, and what has been utterly transformative, is the arrival of data and data visualization and things like that. It's like a body swerve for the discipline. And actually and you talk about all these other disciplines suddenly taking an interest in it. It's because they see it as a means to visualize some of the data, and actually they see it as a way of answering some of the questions that they have. But the reason no one here is presenting at IBG is because no one will get a paper accepted there, because there are no sessions that are running to do with map making or cartography. I mean, that's the truth of it. I could organise a session there, and we'd get, if you got 5 speakers, you'd have 4 people show up, and they'd all be speakers. That would be how the session runs in the geography. And so there is this interesting juxtaposition between the outward-facing identity of the discipline and actually what's happening within universities. But what has massively changed in the last few years, I say, is data coming along, and this idea of data visualization and students wanting to do it. And to their credit, enormous efforts from the Royal Geographical Society, who have been lobbying hard for geography and data skills in geography to be on the GCSE and A-level curriculum, and maps are the entry point to that. So actually we're seeing, the good news is that undergraduates, when they come to us, they've done a lot, they've worked with maps a lot more, particularly data maps, in a way that they hadn't 3 or 4 years ago. And just one final thing on that, there's a huge demand for teachers. If any of you know teachers or are available, teachers don't know how to make maps, and they now have to do that as part of their teaching in schools, particularly with data and GIS, because most of them went through a curriculum where it wasn't really taught in geography departments. And so they are really crying out now, because they've been told they've got to teach this, they really need help. So if anyone, I would say if we're trying to capacity build here, I'd definitely explore your network. If you've got teachers out there who need help, definitely help them.
Can I take the gentleman who hasn't spoken yet, please? Yeah?
So I've been thinking about going out on this Zoom for quite some time. I think it's really going to show me up. But when I first got involved, I sort of became a member of SoC. My background is much more sort of GIS, And it's interesting what you were saying about the different sides of your brain. I don't think of myself as artistic, and I wonder if part of the problem is the grand history we have in this country with cartography, which, if I'm honest, when I was looking at this and thinking, should I join the Cartographic Society, the first thoughts that came to my head was, actually, I can't draw photography. Do you know what I mean? There's an assumption that if it's cartography, because there's this grand history of being able to take a big piece of paper and draw an amazing map, if you can't do it, it's not for you. And I thought, actually, no, that's not right. If cartography's got to have a future, it's got to be able to appeal to both sides. It's got to be able to reach out to people like myself who wish they could draw, but can't really. And actually, it's got to be about making sure that we can explain the principles about how you make those maps better still. And actually tying together the graphics. It's not, you don't have to necessarily be a graphics designer, do you, to create a great map, but you might need to know one. And it's about, I wonder whether or not there's a little bit of history that maybe gets in the way when other people look at cartography. What do they think a cartographer is? And, is it about changing the way they see a cartographer from being a person, probably a person that can do an amazing drawing, into a science that you should go try?
I completely agree with that. I think, again, my perspective from coming from the web development industry and the data visualization aspect from there, a lot of JavaScript development and stuff. If you ask someone, what is cartography, they wouldn't have a clue. They would probably say Ordnance Survey or something like that, but they wouldn't think it's what they were already doing, which was making maps with D3 or something, or something like that. That was just a means to an end for them. And I think there is a certain situation where maybe because of the terminology or just the lack of knowing where to go, or the lack of involvement perhaps with communities that beyond geography, like JavaScript development, for example, that's what web-based maps are made out of. There is a lot of people that are probably dying to know about the fundamentals and where to go and what they should be learning and things like that. I think that's a huge wealth of people that are ready to be interested in this and actively involved.
Okay, we've got a little bit away from visualization. I'm probably going to have to wind up in a minute, but I'm too old to go back and relearn, but I'm going to teach myself this visualization lark. I know a good book about cartography. You can't beat maps and diagrams, let's face it. But can either of the panel recommend a tome, a guru who's written something that will tell me what I need to know about this mythical visualization of data? Is there such a thing?
Well, Jack Bertand's Semiology of Graphics has got a lot of maps in it.
I want the non-map stuff now.
But it's predominantly non-map stuff, but he wrote the manual that both communities use.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone offer from the floor anywhere? Alex?
Yeah, what about Edward Tuft? Visualization of quantitative design, or whatever it's called.
Say that again?
Tuft.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you guys look for inspiration? Do you look at good websites? Do you look at colleagues? Do you look at...
I would have thought that cartography and introduction would be a good place to start.
Nothing like a bit of self-publicity there, Giles, thank you. Yeah. Anyone wants to learn about... No, let's not go there.
Andy Kirk's got a nice book on data visualization.
Who?
Andy Kirk.
Okay, yeah.
I'd look at the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post when there's a massive national event happening, and they have this arms race where they try and outdo each other in terms of visualization and cartography. And I would look at that and go, I want to learn how to do that, and then go from there. Because I think that's the strongest inspiration is to see something and work it out. Because actually there's so many worked examples online of people. Most of what you see online has been cribbed from someone else somewhere else, and it's often there on forums and things like that. It's just become sophisticated at Googling and...
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's a case of, for me at least, it's just, online, places like Twitter is great for inspiration and stuff, but, there's a good newsletter.
There's a newsletter called Spatial Awareness, I believe. Well, let's all get into self-publicity then, yeah?
No. But what I'm saying is that there's places that, collate this kind of material, and, there's ones that are focused more on the data visualization specifically. There's ones that are focused on data visualization in government. There's a real sort of invigoration of newsletters and things like that, and there's many of them around there. So I think that's a good place to start because they're curated.
Just give us the summation that you put into your newsletter. Where would we find your summation newsletter?
Where would you find
it?
Just Google spatial awareness newsletter.
Yeah, it compiles a bi-weekly newsletter of interesting stuff. Just Google it, spatial awareness. We have a comment from Ken, please.
I can recommend a thoroughly good book. It's called Information Graphics by Robert Harris. It's published in the year 2000.
Okay.
A comprehensive illustrated reference, and on the front cover he illustrates and uses the words graphs, maps, tables, diagrams, charts.
Okay. Author name?
Robert Harris.
Okay. Has David McCandless written the book or not?
Yeah,
but all right. Okay, I think unless there's any concluding comments from the table, I did want it to be not a conflict but a discussion. I hope we've covered the synergies, the possibilities. Does anyone any of you got the opportunity to a closing comment if you wish?
Did anyone guess what that map was from that I showed?
It's from the physical atlas. Scalar or justice purpose? Your very first one.
You're close enough, yeah. The Physicaler Atlas, 1892 this was published. But Tom Harper at the British Library, sorry, it's a honeymoon picture. Tom Harper recommended this. It's the first atlas that actually combines information visualization with cartography. Basically, it's an atlas purely of information visualization, I would say, of different data sets around the world. So it's all on Davy Rumsey maps and things, but I definitely recommend going through that and seeing the many visual forms they take when they're mapping these things. Why don't you get the coffee cup?
I guess my concluding comment, I fully accept all the arguments that I've heard, and I do obviously think that cartography very much does sit within overall data visualization. But just picking up on a point that Vivian made this morning, I suspect that not many people go into Stanford's shop and ask for a data visualization of Chianti.
Yes. Okay, I think it's time to roll up for a coffee break. So can I just ask you to show your appreciation to the 4 members of the panel?